I didn't see anybody at 8:30, so I assume we all remembered to set our clocks back. Open your Bibles to Ezekiel Chapter 9. Ezekiel Chapter 9. So we continue to move through our study of the book of Ezekiel. We talked like the last time we had class, we talked about chapter 8, which was a vision that Isaiah saw that was prophesying or forecasting the coming punishment upon the nation of Judah because of the wickedness. Chapter 9 is a vision of that punishment actually coming. He talks about some of the things that happened in some figurative language. Chapter 9 opens up. It's a continuation actually of chapter 8. He cried, that is God cried, and my ears a loud voice saying, bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. Behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And there was a man clothed in linen with a writing case at his waist. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. You're getting the kind of setup here. God is speaking and said it's time for this punishment to come. And there were 6 men who came from the north. It says with their destroying weapon in their hand. That is with their battle weapon, ready for battle. The fact that they came from the north is a representation of Babylon coming from the north. And these 6 men are representative of the Babylonian army. Even though Judah was here, and Babylon was kind of over here, because of the topography of the land and other things, when people from Babylon came to the promised land, they went this way. They went up over the desert and the mountains, and they came down from the north. So even though Babylon was east, when their army came, they actually came from the north. And so he also said there was a man clothed in linen with a writing case at his waist. Being clothed in linen is a representation of perfection and purity. This was a man who was a representative of God, where he was what kind of individual we're talking about here, I don't really know. But it says he had a writing case at his waist. Now you have to remember, I carry a pen with me everywhere I go. I've mentioned before, I get sermon ideas and illustrations in all kinds of places. And if I don't take the time to write them down, I forget them. And so I've always got a pen on me. But you have to remember, in this day and age, they had writing instruments, but they weren't pens like we had. They had bottles of ink, and then they had what we would call a stylus that they would dip in the ink, and that's what they wrote with. And most of the time, that ink had to be mixed with water to thin it out a little bit so the ink would last a little bit longer. And so when he talks about a writing case, he's talking about a case of some kind, a box, or maybe something made out of leather that he wore around his waist that contained within it a bottle of ink, a bottle of water, and the stylus that he used to write with. So that whenever he needed to write, he had the material there available for him to write with. Some of you suggest there may have been within that writing case some parchment or some kind of paper, or whatever you want to call it, that they could write on. But he had the materials there that he needed. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar. The glory of God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested in the threshold of the house. What do you think? What's he talking about when he said gone up from the cherub? What cherub? Okay, you remember the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat that was inside the holy place, represented the dwelling place of God. That's where the high priest went in to meet God in the Day of Atonement. And he says here the glory of God had moved from the cherub to the threshold. It moved from the cherub to the door. And as we move through this chapter, you're going to see this continual theme of God moving, of God leaving. God leaving the mercy seat is a message. It's a message to the children of Israel that that's not the mercy seat anymore. That's not the place where God's glory is going to be anymore. And we mentioned on a couple of occasions that the children of the Jews placed too much trust in that physical building. The fact that they had the temple, and that's where the dwelling place of God was, meant they were going to be okay. Well, the glory of God moving from that seat of atonement is telling them that's not the case anymore. This is not going to be the dwelling place of God. And we're going to see this several times throughout the next couple of chapters. He called on the man clothed in linen who had the writing case in his waist, and the Lord said to him, pass through the city through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. Now I want to stop here for just a moment. He's marking certain people. This man in the linen clothing, who's a messenger of God, is marking certain people, and says he's marking those who are sighing and groaning over all the abominations that are committed in it. What abominations? We just remember we talked last week about the fact they had put idols in the courtyard of the temple itself. They were worshiping idols where they were supposed to be worshiping God. There was immorality and unholiness and all kinds of wickedness that was connected to that worship that was taking place within the courtyard, within the very place that God was supposed to be worshipped. And notice he says these people were sighing and groaning over all those abominations. They were upset. Who would be sighing and groaning over all of this wickedness? The remnant, the righteous people. The few Jews that were left that were righteous will be upset over all this wickedness and immorality going on. And so the fact that he's marking the ones who are sighing and groaning over the wickedness means he's marking the righteous people. He's making a distinction about those. And then after that's over, he says in verse 5, and to the other he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him and strike. Your eye shall not spare, you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but touch no one on whom the mark is found, and began at my sanctuary. Destruction was coming. God is here making this distinction between the righteous people and the wicked people. And he says, you are to strike down then. You're to have no pity, no compassion. Throughout much of the Old Testament, God had showed great compassion and great mercy to the nation of Israel. What God is now saying is that time is over. The time for compassion, the time for pity, the time for mercy is gone. Now it's the time for judgment. Now it's the time for you to pay the price for the things that you have done. And he says, kill old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women. Why little children?
Because they're going to grow up.
There are some who actually say, and I don't know that I quite totally agree with this, but there are some who say that those little children who killed were actually done a favor, because they weren't allowed to grow up in an idolatrous, immoral nation. And the fact that they were little children meant, where did they go when they die? They go to heaven. They go to be with God. But the fact of the matter is, when you have a war, everybody suffers. I find it really interesting, and you may not, but I find it really interesting when I hear people talking about trying to conduct a humane war. Pardon my English, but there ain't no such thing. War is about as inhumane as you can get. And we are all aware of the fact that it's not just soldiers that suffer in war. Go look at Afghanistan. Go look at some of these countries that are involved in war over the last several years, and look at the famine, look at the devastation, look at the destruction, look at the kids who are left without parents. Look at the kids who die. It's just, war is horrible. And no child of God should ever like war. It happens, but it should be as a last resort. But when war comes, everybody suffers. Old men suffer, young men suffer, old women suffer, young women suffer, children suffer, everybody does. Because that's simply a part of war. That's just the way it is. An interesting thing is, notice where they supposed to, where'd they start? At my sanctuary. Remember we talked last week about the elders of Israel who were standing at the temple with their back to the temple, praying to the sun god? Start with those who are supposed to be my religious leaders. These are the people who are supposed to be showing Judah the right way to live, and they're doing the exact opposite. We need to understand that God holds those who call themselves leaders of his people to a higher standard. He expects those people to be the right kind of people because they're supposed to be leading the ones who are behind them. So one of the things we need to understand is most human beings are followers. Most of us do not operate as leaders. Most of us are followers. And because most of us are followers, that says two things. Number one, it says we need to pay a great deal of attention to who we pick as a leader. Make sure we're picking the right kind of leader. But the second thing it says, it places an awful lot of importance upon the conduct of those leaders. If you go back and look at the history of the nation of Israel, I find this very interesting. When the children of Israel had a good king, they were a righteous people. When they had a bad king, they were a wicked people. And that's without exception. Now, there were some good people during those wicked times. And there were some wicked people during those righteous times. With a general rule, when the children of Israel had a good, righteous king, they were a good, righteous people. When they had a wicked king, they were a wicked people because they were following their leaders. And one of the greatest problems Judah had at this point was that their leaders, not only the king, but their priests and their prophets and all of their religious leaders were going in the wrong direction. And when they go in the wrong direction, guess what happens to the whole nation? They go right along with them. Remember Jesus in the book of Matthew talked about the blind leading the blind? When the blind leads the blind, they both end up in a ditch. That's kind of the idea he's talking about here. Start with my sanctuary. Defile the house and fill the courts with the slain. Go out. So they went out and struck in the city. It is, I think, a very important point to make when he says in verse 7, defile the house. What house?
His house.
The temple. The temple was supposed to be a place of holiness. The temple was supposed to be a place where God was. And God said to these men, defile the house. In other words, kill people within the confines of the temple itself. But the fact of the matter is, the Jews had defiled that temple a long time before. With their immorality, with their idolatry, with all that house was already defiled. It wasn't God's house anymore. While they were striking, I was left alone. I fell on my face and cried, O Lord God, will you destroy all the remnant of Israel in the outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem? There are a couple of things I think that are interesting in Ezekiel's response. And number one thing I think about this, he basically says, I'm the only one left. Was Ezekiel really the only one left? He was not the only righteous person in Judah. Because at this time, he wasn't even in Judah. He was at the river Kibar. But he wasn't even the only righteous one at Kibar. I know two automatically. One of them named Jeremiah and the other one named Daniel. They were prophesying at the same time. They were righteous people. There were still righteous people. But he felt like he was the only one. And then he said, God, are you going to destroy everybody? Are you going to destroy the remnant? Jeremiah had talked about the remnant. Ezekiel talked about the remnant. The fact that in every case where God had destroyed a nation, that nation had passed out of existence. No longer to be heard from. Judah was going to be different. Because Judah was going to have a remnant. There were going to be some left. And what Ezekiel is concerned with here is, what about the remnant, God? What about the ones you promised to protect? And it's interesting, this is the only verse in Ezekiel where Ezekiel expresses compassion for his nation. What nickname do we give Jeremiah? The weeping prophet. Because throughout the book of Jeremiah, you see Jeremiah's connection and Jeremiah's concern and Jeremiah's care for his nation. The only place in the book where Ezekiel mentions that. And no doubt, Jeremiah and Ezekiel came from a little bit different perspective, a little bit different background. Jeremiah wrote still in Jerusalem. Jeremiah was watching all that stuff happening. Ezekiel was in Babylon. That may have something to do with it, but this is the only place where we see Ezekiel's compassion for his people. And then in verse 9, he begins to tell them, he begins to explain to Ezekiel why this is happening. He says, the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of blood, and the city full of injustice. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. As for me, my eyes will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will bring their deeds upon their head. I think it's important to note that when a nation that believes in God stops believing in God, their moral fiber is gone. Because there's no foundation for moral standards. When you remove God, you remove any objective standard of right and wrong. Now, what is left is a subjective standard, which means I get to decide. And if I think I'm going to bash your hen with a hammer, I can do that because there's no law that tells me I can't, because there's no God. If God does not exist, then where's the limit? Where do you draw the line? How do you form any kind of moral standard of right and wrong without God? That's the objective standard. Anything else is subjective, and anything else changes with time. If you allow man to be the final say-so, it's going to change. I don't know how true this is, but I read an article Friday that 70% of the American people believe homosexual marriage is good. 70%. That same poll, if you'd taken it 25 years ago, what do you think the result would have been? 15 years ago. 10 years ago. In 1973, when the Supreme Court issued a ruling that abortion was constitutional and legal, 75% of the American people opposed abortion. 75%. It's now less than 40%. Because man is fickle. We just talked about the fact that most people are followers. We just kind of go along with the flow. Whatever the majority wants, whatever the crowd wants, whatever is popular, whatever accepted, that's what man does. And there is no standard. No immovable standard. God is the immovable standard. And he talks about the fact in this verse, Judah is exceedingly great. Now, he's already talked about the immorality. He's already talked about the idolatry. He's talked about all that stuff. But then notice he says the land is full of blood. There were people being murdered. There were people who were dying. The city is full of injustice. When you take God out of the picture, you're going to open up the door for everything else. And God basically says to Ezekiel, Judah deserved to be punished because of the way she was living. As for me, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will bring their deeds upon their heads. It's very interesting. Earlier in the chapter, I guess a couple of verses before, when these people were trying to justify what they were doing, they said, the Lord has forsaken the city, and his eye cannot see. I wonder if they really had convinced themselves that God couldn't see.
I think a lot of people have.
I'm not so sure about that. I think in their actions they're saying that, but I think in their mind they know better. Now, if you don't believe in God, that's a different issue. People who are atheists, and some of those people I'm not sure about, they claim to be atheists, but I'm not sure they really are when push comes to shove. I remember somebody wrote one time, there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. And when push comes to shove, one of the first things man usually does is cry out for God. But anyway, it's just some of this stuff, they had convinced themselves at least on the surface that God wasn't seeing them anymore. God had forsaken the city. Had God forsaken the city? God, Judah, who moved? Judah. God didn't forsake anybody. God never has forsaken anybody. If your relationship with God is not what it ought to be or not what it used to be, that's your problem. God didn't do anything. God was in the place he was always in. God was in the place when he gave the Ten Commandments to Moses. God is in the same place when he led the nation under David. God was in the same place when he led the nation under Hezekiah. God hadn't gone anywhere. And God's still not going anywhere. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. God says, I can see. My eye sees it. But the compassion is gone. And I do not believe God's compassion runs out in the sense that God stops. God can't have any more compassion because he used it all up. But I do believe, and I believe Scripture backs this up, that God reached a point with people when he says, I'm done. My mercy, my compassion has run its course, and now it's time for judgment. I think that's true with the flood. I think that's true with the children of Israel entering the land of Canaan. Because remember when he talked to Abraham, he said that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. They haven't gotten to that point yet. When Joshua and the children of Israel came along, they had gotten to that point, and God punished those people because of their wickedness. I think it was true of the northern kingdom. I think it's true of the southern kingdom. And if we don't watch out what we're doing, someday it's going to be true of us. Now, I'm not sure. I talked to somebody about this last night. I'm not sure we're not at that point already. I don't know. Because I can't read God's mind. Behold, the man clothed in linen with a writing case at his waist brought back word saying, I have done as you commanded me. In other words, God's will has been fulfilled. One of the lessons we learn, I think, from both the Old Testament and New Testament as well, but we see it, I think, more fully in the Old Testament, is God's will always comes through. Our choice is, are we going to help God, or are we going to fight God? And that's the choice we got. God's will is going to be fulfilled. What he plans, what he purposes is going to happen. Are you going to fall in line with that and help that will succeed, or are you going to fight against it and have it succeed in spite of you? Because you will not stop it. It is highly audacious of man to think that I can stand up and I can stop God. Yeah. It's been tried. You want to have a question or comment?
I saw a program once about Anthony Griff in the ocean for 40 days with a shark. He said he was the only survivor of 4. He said that the program that you can take the thing, say by being in a foxhole and times it by 10.
Anyone else? Chapter 10. And looked and behold, on the expanse that was over the heads of the cherubims, there appeared to them something like a sapphire, in appearance like a throne. And he said to the man clothed in linen, go in among the whirling wheels underneath the cherubim, fill your hands with burning coals from between the cherubim, and scatter them over the city. Now he says there's a vision. It's over the heads of the cherubim. Now where's the cherubim? The mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. And so we're back at the cherub, we're back at the Ark of the Covenant. And there is a vision of something like a sapphire in appearance like a throne. It looks like, notice it doesn't say it is a throne. It said it looks like a throne. Which to me seems to be a representation of God. This is God's throne in the Holy of Holies. And with that throne, he says there are whirling wheels underneath the cherubim. Now, the cherubim had their wings outstretched, and underneath those wings, evidently, there were what he calls whirling wheels. Remember back in chapter 1, when we first started this study, he talked about wheels inside of wheels, and the wheels were going this way, and the wheels inside were going this way. This is going to come back into play here in this chapter. He talks about taking coals, burning coals between the cherubim, scattering them over the city. Burning coals are oftentimes used in Scripture as a symbol of cleansing. Remember in Isaiah chapter 6 when Isaiah saw that great vision and he said, I am undone for I am man of unclean lips. And God said to one of the angels, take the tongs and take one of the coals and touch his lips and he'll be purified. So the picture here is of the city of Jerusalem being purified. Now, the fact of the matter is it's being purified by destruction. But it's being purified. He went before my eyes. The cherubims were standing on the south side of the house. When the man went and a cloud filled the inner court, the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with cloud. The court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. And the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. The cherubs and the wheels started in the Ark of the Covenant. You hear the whirling, you hear the moving, and now they're at the threshold. What's the threshold? Threshold is the entrance. It's where you go in. And so now the cherubs and the glory of God are moving from the mercy seat to the threshold. They are moving out of or going toward the exit to get out of the temple. The cherub stretched out his hand from between the cherubims to the fire that was between the cherubim, and took some of it and put it in the hands of the man clothed in linen, who took it and went out. The cherubim appeared to have the form of a human form under their wings. And he looked, and behold, there were 4 wheels beside the cherubim, one beside the cherub, and the appearance of the wheels was like sparkling beryl. And as for their appearance, the 4 had the same likeness as if it were a wheel within a wheel. Back to chapter 1, a wheel inside a wheel. While they went in any of 4 directions without turning as they went. In whatever direction the front wheel faced, the others followed without turning as they went. And so you've got a wheel inside of it. You've got this wheel going this way, and this wheel going this way. So when you want to go this way, this wheel takes control, and it goes that way. When you want to go that way, this wheel can take control, and it goes that way. And there's no steering wheel. It doesn't turn. It just goes whichever wheel takes control. If it wants to go that way, then it turns to go, or it goes that way, or it goes that way. Because you've got wheels, and I know this, it doesn't really make sense to us. You've got wheels inside of wheels. You've got one wheel going this way, and either on the inside or the outside of that wheel, you've got a wheel going this way. And so it can go in any 4 directions without a steering wheel. When they went in any of the 4 directions without turning as they went, but in whatsoever direction the front wheel faced, the others followed without turning. Their whole body, their rims and their spokes and their wings were full of eyes all around the wheels that the 4 of them had. What are eyes symbolic of? I didn't think that was that difficult. What do eyes do? They see. And so the fact that these wheels had eyes all around them meant they could see in every direction. Again, it's a representation of the power of God. God can see everything. God can see everywhere. And their whole body, their rims, their spokes, their wings, and their wheels were full of eyes all around, the wheels that the 4 of them had. As to the wheels, they were called in my hearing the whirling wheels. Everyone had 4 faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, the second a human, the third a lion, and the fourth of an eagle. The cherubim mounted up. These were the living creatures I saw by the Kidron Canal. When the cherubs went, the whole wheels went beside them. When the cherubim lifted up their wings to mount up from the earth, the wheels did not turn from beside them. While they stood still, these stood still. When they mounted up, these mounted up with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in them. What he's saying is the cherubims are here, the wheels are beside them. When the cherubim moved, the wheels moved. When the cherubim stayed still, the wheels stayed still. And so you've got a process here of moving. The glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. The cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out with the wheels beside them. And they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of Israel was over them. These were the living creatures I saw underneath the God of Israel by the Kidron Canal, and I knew they were cherubim. Each had 4 faces, each had 4 wings, underneath their wings the likeness of human hands. As for the likeness of their faces, they were the same faces whose appearance I had seen by the Kidron Canal, and each one of them went straight forward. The glory of God, the presence of God, that had been in that temple over that Ark of the Covenant since it had been constructed, is now leaving. It's moving. And there's one very important point we need to make here. The reason it moved, I think, is because that temple can't be destroyed if God's still in it. In order for that temple to be destroyed, in order for the city of Jerusalem to be destroyed, God had to leave. Because the Babylonians can't beat God. He doesn't necessarily have to fight for the Babylonians. He just simply has to not fight for Judah. And if he doesn't fight for Judah, Judah's going to lose. They can't beat the Babylonians by themselves. Israel never won a battle in existence by itself. Every time they went into battle without God, they lost. And that's the whole point of this chapter to me. God is leaving. God's compassion, God's mercy, God's kindness for the nation of Judah has been laid out, been wiped out because of their own wickedness. Does anyone have a question or comment? Well, this is in a figurative manner. God doesn't really, in reality, move anywhere. God's in heaven. And God is wherever God is. It's just like when it talked about when they built the ark, built the temple, and they put the Ark of the Covenant, and they said, this is God's dwelling place. That literally wasn't God's dwelling place. You can't build a physical building that will hold God. It was a representation of the man of God's dwelling place. And when he talks about God moving, it's talking about the fact that the representation of God that was in that temple is not there anymore. God had forsaken the temple. God had forsaken Jerusalem. And the destruction is coming. One of the things we have to understand is we try to make God like man. And we try to fix him to a specific location. Well, God is in the temple. That means he's not in Babylon. No. God's in the temple and God's in Babylon. God's in the United States and God's in Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and Israel and Egypt and Western Europe and the far. God's everywhere. You can't limit. And when it talks about God forsaking or God leaving, it's talking about God withdrawing his protection and God withdrawing his help for those people. He's in the same place he's always been. I almost said same place physically, but I don't really want to use that word because God's not physical. It's hard for us to understand this. It's hard for us as human beings to grasp this because I can't be in two places at once. God can be in 10 million places at once. God's everywhere, all at one time. How? I don't know. He's God. Anyone else have a question or comment? We will pick up with chapter 11 next Sunday morning. And I'm done.